Hello everyone, I'm Ruba Bayram, a third year medical student, and today I'll be discussing the anatomy of the skull as part of our self-study. Before I start, I would like to advise you to follow through the video by using your own skull if you have, or a diagram and labeling through. We'll go through the external features of the skull, and then the internal and the normal basalis. I won't focus mostly on the external. It is going to be mostly the internal and the occipital and the normal basalis, because this is what I found a lot of the students were struggling with. So let's start with the external features. We need to know the bones. We have the frontal bone, right? And it's one frontal bone. At the beginning it used to be two, but then it starts fusing together, so we only have one frontal bone. We have two parietal bones, right and left. What are these? These are sutures. This is indication of when two bones meet. So this suture, it has a name because it is running through the coronal plane. You know it's the coronal plane, and the coronal, sagittal, right? So this coronal plane, so therefore this is called as the coronal suture. This is the sagittal suture, right? Then we have my occipital bone. The occipital bone and the parietal bones, when they meet, they form the lambdoid suture. The reason why it's called the lambdoid, because it is representing the shape of a lambda, right? This one. Now we also have the temporal bone, which are from the side. These are the temples. So this is the temporal bone. We have right and left. We also have my zygomatic bone, which is also the cheekbone. Okay, we have the maxilla, again right and left, right? We have the sphenoid bone, which is deep inside. You have the ethmoid bone. We have the lacrimal bone, so lacrimal, ethmoid, and the sphenoid. What else do we have? We have the vomer bone, and this is the anterior nasal aperture. Dividing, when we have the nose, we have the two nasal openings. They are divided by a nasal septum. The bony nasal septum. The bony septum is formed by two parts. We have the upper part, which is formed by the ethmoid bone. So this upper part of the nasal septum, it is by the ethmoid bone, but the lower half, it is formed by the vomer. Vomer is another bone. It's a very small bone that is just going to be forming this lower part of my nasal septum. The upper part, okay, so this is the vomer. The one that is above it, this is made by the ethmoid. These are the superior, okay, and the inferior nasal concha. They're helping in the movement of the air inside of the nose and the surface area. Not important right now. Now this is also the anterior nasal spine. Okay. What else do we need to know? These are the orbits. Inside of the orbits, you can clearly see that there are some structures here. I will have the superior orbital fissure and the inferior orbital fissure, as you can see. So this is the inferior orbital fissure and superior orbital fissure. There's a lot of structures that are going to pass through. We're discussing them later. Here you can also see that there's these dots, these foramins, right? We have the supra-orbital, these are the orbits. Above it, supra, so supra-orbital foramen, and this is the infra-orbital foramen. Again, structures are passing through. For instance, in the infra-orbital foramen, it is the infraorbital nerve and the infraorbital artery that is passing through. The infraorbital nerve, it is it's a branch of the maxillary nerve, which is the second branch of my trigeminal nerve. The trigeminal nerve, it is the largest nerve, cranial nerve number 5, right? We'll look into this later. We're going to be discussing the nerves as well, so hopefully it will be a great revision. I think this is it for the most part. You will see a lot of sometimes, for instance, on the parietal bone here, you can see that there's some sort of foramen here. These are known as the parietal emissionary foramen, where the emissionary veins are going to be found. They are the veins that are connecting the external veins with the internal veins that are inside. You will find them in a lot of the bones. The temporal bone, it has a lot of parts. It has the squamous part of the temporal bone. We have the mastoid, we have the styloid process. This is, by the way, the external auditory meatus, the ear, right? The external auditory meatus. You have the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. From the name, zygomatic process of the temporal bone, it means that the bone is the temporal bone, but from the temporal bone I have a process coming out of it known as the zygomatic process, because this process is attaching to the bone اللي هي the zygomatic bone, which is my cheekbone, as you remember. So this is the zygomatic arch. It is formed by the articulation between the zygomatic process of my temporal bone and my zygomatic bone. Okay, does that make sense? So from the name we can identify zygomatic process of the temporal bone. What does it mean? The bone is the temporal bone, but from it comes a process that is attaching to the other bone, which is the zygomatic bone. لأنه اسمها zygomatic process. Okay. المهم طبعا what is this right here? You can see, very important clinically. This is the pterion area. This is the thinnest part of the skull. You can see how to identify the H-shaped. Can you see that there is an H-shaped here? This is the point of meeting between all the four bones. What is this bone? Parietal, frontal, temporal, and this sphenoid. So when all those four bones meet, they are forming this H shape. This is known as the pterion, very thin the thinnest part of the skull, which is important clinically because if, for instance, you hit your head on the side, on the pterion, this is very likely that you're going to be damaging the structures that are laying right next to the pterion. We'll look into what are these structures. If you guys remember, it is the middle meningeal artery, and if it was damaged, it can cause epidural hematoma. We'll discuss this more in detail inside. Tamam? Lastly, here the occipital bone. We also have its own structures like the external occipital protuberance. We have the from it comes the superior knuckle line, and then we have the inferior knuckle line. There's also the highest knuckle line. You won't see it, mostly imaginary. Tamam? You have from the external occipital protuberance and external occipital crest going all the way down. Tamam? This is the foramen magnum. خلينا نجي هسه to the internal features. Internal features of my skull. The skull, I can divide it into three. The cranial fossa I can divide it into three parts to make it much easier. We have the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. When we're looking at the fossas, one advice I would like to give you is you need to look at what specific part of the bone I'm looking at to understand the structures. So always follow these steps. First, what am I looking at? This is the anterior cranial fossa. What makes up this fossa? Let's look into it. Okay, so we have the anterior cranial fossa. It is made of which bone? What is this bone right here? This one. This is the frontal bone, right? Do you guys remember? This is my frontal bone. So the bone that is making the anterior cranial fossa is my frontal bone. Let's start with the structures. First thing is this. This is the frontal crest. Tamam? The frontal crest. Then we have the foramen cecum. Can you see there is a foramen right here? Yeah. So the foramen cecum is here. Again, foramen crest. This, the crest. Foramen cecum. We have crista galli. The structure, it looks like a crystal right here. Can you see? Looks like a crystal. Okay. Crista galli. We have the cribriform plate. You can see how there's a lot of these dots, right? The cribriform plate right here. Here, this is where the cranial nerve number 1, which is the olfactory nerve, is going to be coming out. So it takes all the sensations, right? It takes all the sensations from here. It leaves through the cribriform plate. This olfactory nerve starts to come out, and then it goes to the brain to pass the sensory information to the brain to get processed. Tamam? So again, the anterior cranial fossa, very easy. First thing you need to identify, what is the bone? We said the bone that is making up this region, which is the anterior cranial fossa, is my frontal bone. What are the structures? Since it's the frontal bone, you have frontal crest, foramen cecum, crista galli, looks like a crystal, cribriform plate, which is part of the ethmoid bone. These are the cribriform plate right here. Coming out of it is my cranial nerve number 1, which is my olfactory nerve, okay, collecting the sensory information, and then coming out, going to the brain to get processed. This right here, this is forming the roof of the orbits. The name of this surface is known as the orbital surface of the frontal bone. Again, when you have a name, dissect it. Okay, so orbital surface of frontal bone or frontal, yeah. So the bone is the frontal bone. We just discussed it. The bone is the frontal bone. We understood the second half of the name. Orbital surface is because it is forming this surface right here that you can see, right? It is forming the roof of my orbits. These are my orbits right here. So it forms the roof. This surface, right? This surface, it's forming the roof of my orbits. Tamam? Did we understand? So this is why it's called the orbital surface of my frontal bone. This is it. And this is the sphenoid bone. this butterfly shape is my sphenoid bone here. So this is the lesser wing of the sphenoid. It can also form part of my anterior cranial fossa. Next, we will go to the middle cranial fossa. This is the middle cranial fossa. Again, what did I mention? When we're going to a different region, identify what is the bone that is forming this region. What are the bones? So in the middle cranial fossa, the bones that are forming this region is my sphenoid bone, the butterfly shape that you can see right here. So this is the ending of it. This is the sphenoid bone. This is the butterfly shape, and the temporal bone. These are the temples, right? This is my temporal bone from the side. So the temporal bone is also forming the middle cranial fossa. Tamam? Tamam. So the temporal bone is also forming the middle cranial fossa. Let's look at the structures now. Very importantly, what can we first see here? We have the optic canal. Optic canal, because if you can see, when I put my pencil here, you will see that it will open into the orbits. Tamam? It will open into the orbits. This is the optic canal. From the optic canal, what happens is that I have the ophthalmic artery going inside, okay? And the ophthalmic artery will give us branches like the supratrochlear, the supraorbital, whatever. We have the ophthalmic artery going inside, and the optic nerve will collect information from the eyes, and then the optic nerve will come out. When they come out, they meet together. The optic nerve is cranial nerve number 2. It comes out, meet together at this area to form the optic chiasma. Tamam? It forms the optic chiasma. So this is my optic canal. If you can see my pen, can you see it? Can you? Yeah, you can see it. So it is what opening into the orbits. What is going inside? What is going inside? The ophthalmic artery is going in, and the optic nerve collect the information, and it comes out of this optic canal. They meet together to form the optic chiasma, and they sit on this area. This area is called as the sella turcica. This is what bone? Sphenoid bone. The sella turcica. This is the sella turcica. The sella turcica are consisting of this is the tuberculum sellae. This is the dorsum sellae, and you can see clearly that there's a fossa in between. If you can see from the side as well, there's a fossa. There's a fossa, right? So here you can see that there's a fossa. This is the tuberculum sellae, the dorsum sellae, and there's a fossa inside. This is known as the hypophyseal fossa. What sits inside is my pituitary gland. The pituitary gland will sit inside. Tamam? So, again, optic nerve come out, form the optic chiasma. They sit on the tuberculum sellae. When they sit on this area here, tuberculum sellae, they form an impression. This impression is going to be called as the sulcus chiasmaticus, okay, or sometimes known as the groove of the optic chiasma, whatever you want to call it. Two names عادي. But you need to understand the optic nerve, when they come out, they meet together to form the optic chiasma. When they sit on the tuberculum sellae, they form an impression. This impression is known as the sulcus chiasma. Okay, this is the hypophyseal fossa, as we mentioned, the dorsum sellae. These two, as you can see, this is known as the what? Anterior clinoid process. Anterior clinoid process. Tamam? The anterior clinoid process, and you also have a posterior clinoid process and also a middle. So this is the anterior clinoid. The middle is on the tuberculum sellae, and the posterior clinoid process is on the dorsum sellae. Most important that you need to know in our checklist is the anterior clinoid process, this one. Okay? Tamam. Next, what are we going to see is we are going to look at the foramens. Again, here as you can see clearly, there's 3 foramens. On which bone is it? Again, I mentioned you need to follow through. What is the bone? So this bone right here is my sphenoid bone, specifically the greater wing of my sphenoid bone. This was the lesser wing. This is the lesser wing, the small one. This all is the greater wing. The greater wing of my sphenoid, we have 3 foramens. Okay, foramen number 1 is my rotundum, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. It follows a single line on my greater wing of my sphenoid. Rotundum, ovale, spinosum. What is passing through them is M. First M, maxillary nerve. The maxillary nerve enters the rotundum, foramen rotundum. Maxillary nerve is what? Second branch of my trigeminal nerve. Foramen ovale, the other M is mandibular nerve. mandibular nerve will enter through the foramen ovale, which is the third branch of my trigeminal nerve. Trigeminal nerve is nerve number 5. Okay. Then we have my foramen spinosum. Here, the other M is, it's not a nerve, it is the middle meningeal artery. Okay. We discussed it. We mentioned that the middle meningeal artery is going to be at the tirion, if you remember, and that if we hit the tirion is the thinnest area or thinnest region of the skull. Do you remember? And I mentioned, how do we identify it? It's the H-shaped. You can see clearly my H-shaped right here, and the thinnest part of the skull. And if you get hit, the structures behind it will get damaged, and you will have epidural hematoma, because the structure that you will find near the tirion is my middle meningeal artery. The middle meningeal artery is going to be coming from the spinosum here, and from the spinosum it needs to reach the tirion. So what happens is that from the foramen spinosum, you can see clearly that there is some sort of groove here, right? Yes, so the middle meningeal artery will come out and it starts moving until it reaches the tirion. وضحت الفكرة؟ مرة ثانية, this is the foramen spinosum. There is clearly a groove. Okay, on this groove the middle meningeal artery will move until it reaches my what? My tirion. Material, this groove. Okay, this groove from the spinosum moves to the tirion. This groove is known as what? The middle meningeal groove. عادي. or العفو groove of the middle meningeal artery. زين. Again, how do you identify foramens? Look at what the bone is. وإحنا when we learn these facts خلاص. On the greater wing of the sphenoid, they have 3 foramen: rotundum, ovale, spinosum. What are the structures passing through? Maxillary nerve, mandibular nerve, middle meningeal artery. Middle meningeal artery, we see the groove and we remember it goes all the way to the tirion. تمام. Also don't forget, here I'm going to be having the superior orbital fissure. You can see it here, the superior orbital fissure. If you can, no, you won't be able to notice, but here I have superior orbital fissure. تمام. You can clearly see it here, can you? Yeah, this is the superior orbital fissure. تمام. And structures are gonna pass through. What are the structures? We mentioned cranial nerve number 1, olfactory nerve here. Cranial nerve number 2, optic nerve. You have then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ونكمل. 3, cranial nerve number 3 is oculomotor. 4 is the trochlear. 5 is my trigeminal, right? 6 is abducens. 7 facial nerve. 8 vestibulocochlear. 9 glossopharyngeal. 10 is vagus. 11 is accessory. 12 is hypoglossal. العموم 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. Okay, don't look at 5. 3, 4, 6 will enter through my superior orbital fissure. So 1, 2, 3, 4 and 6 are going to enter through the superior orbital fissure, and you will see the superior orbital fissure here. Tamam? So through the superior orbital fissure, can you see my pen? Yeah. 3, 4 and 6, oculomotor, trochlear and abducens, they will enter here. Where did 5 go? We said 3, 4, 6. Where's the 5? We skipped 5. 5 is my trigeminal. It's very, very large. It's the largest nerve. It's not gonna enter through the superior orbital. No, it's not. The trigeminal nerve also gives us many branches. We just discussed 2 of them. We discussed the maxillary, the mandibular. So the trigeminal will give branches, and the branches of the trigeminal nerve will enter through the foramens. Tamam? Second branch was maxillary. Third branch was mandibular. What about the first branch? The first branch is the ophthalmic nerve. Ophthalmic nerve branches can enter through the superior orbital fissure. Tamam? Okay. Now let's go. We discussed these. Now we have another foramen here. The foramen here that we see is known as the foramen lacerum. Foramen lacerum, how can I know? It has a very important characteristic, is that it is the foramen that is separating between 2 bones. Again, that's why I insisted on understanding the bones to understand the structures. Foramen lacerum will separate 2 bones, which is, what is this bone? The sphenoid bone and my temporal bone, specifically the petrous part of my temporal bone. You remember the temporal bone, I had mentioned that there's many structures. There's the squamous, the zygomatoprocess, the mastoid, the styloid. Internally, you will see also the petrous part. So the petrous part of the temporal bone is this. The foramen lacerum, it is the foramen that is separating the 2 bones. What are these 2 bones? Sphenoid and petrous. Can you see the end of the sphenoid? The greater wing. This is the end of the sphenoid. and this is the start of my temporal. This is all temporal. This is specifically is the petrous part of my temporal. This foramen lacerum sits right between those. It separates them, the sphenoid and my petrous part of the temporal bone. This is how you know this is the foramen lacerum. Next to the foramen lacerum, always you will see the carotid canal. Okay, next to the foramen lacerum, there is the carotid canal. It's a canal. You see that it's closed. It's not an actual foramen. Okay, it's kind of closed. So next to the foramen lacerum, the carotid canal. When you understand these relations, you'll be able to identify them easily. Okay. So I mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. 5 is the trigeminal. I said it is very large. The trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve number 5, what happens is that it sits on the petrous part of my temporal bone. It sits right here. This is on the petrous bone. You will see that there's some sort of impression. Okay. So some sort of impression here. Wait. Like here. Okay. فتشي نازل شوية. You will feel it mostly. Here is where the trigeminal nerve will be, and it's going to be giving an impression on the petrous bone. So that's why it's called as the trigeminal impression here. So the trigeminal nerve is like this, sitting here. Okay, it's sitting all the way like this, and then it's giving the branches. The second branch is going to the rotundum, the third branch, the mandibular, is going to the oval. So it's giving the branches like this, but it's sitting here. Okay, this is the trigeminal nerve. It's sitting here on the petrous bone, and a petrous part of the temporal bone giving the trigeminal impression. Okay, we are done with my middle cranial fossa, I would say, as I mentioned, made of the sphenoid and my temporal bone. Specifically the petrous part of the temporal bone, also the squamous part, as you can see, the squamous part of the temporal bone. نجي now on the posterior cranial fossa. Posterior cranial fossa is mainly made of what? We have the occipital bone. We also have a part of my parietal is also forming the. This is the parietal. Okay. Also part of the temporal is also found the occipital. This is the temporal, this is the parietal. Anyways, mainly it is my occipital. I just want you to remember mainly it's occipital. Occipital bone also has its own parts. We have the squamous part of my occipital bone. Squamous end is flat. We have the condylar, and we have the basilar. Specifically, this region right here is called as the clivus. Okay, because it is the point of meeting between the basilar part of my occipital bone and the sphenoid bone. Tamam? So this is the clivus, this area. CLIVUS. نجي على الoccipital bone. You remember outside I mentioned that we have the external occipital protuberance. You remember? Internally, I have internal occipital protuberance, which is very clearly, you can see it here. This is the internal occipital protuberance. From the internal occipital protuberance, I have my internal occipital crest moving all the way down. Okay. Now from the internal occipital protuberance, you will see clearly a groove, right? This groove is known as the transverse groove or transverse sulcus, and it is formed due to transverse sinus. So it is formed due to the transverse sinus, collection of venous blood basically. So the transverse sinus will move through the sulcus, and it keeps moving until it forms this S shape. It will drain into my sigmoid sinus. So we have transverse sinus, you can clearly see the groove, right? This is my groove. The transverse sinus will move through this groove, then it forms my sigmoid sinus. Sigmoid sinus is then going to enter this foramen. This foramen right here, which is very close by to my foramen magnum, this foramen is known as my jugular foramen. Because why as well? Jugular foramen, because here when the transverse sinus drains into my sigmoid sinus, the sigmoid sinus, the moment it enters this jugular foramen, it will be known as my internal jugular vein. In AIDS, internal occipital protuberance, there is a sulcus here, transverse sulcus, where the transverse sulcus is on the bone. What is causing this transverse sulcus is my transverse sinus. Transverse sinus moves. Again, we have another sulcus, sigmoid sulcus. What is causing the sigmoid sulcus on the bone? The impression is caused it's caused by my sigmoid sulcus, collection of venous blood. Sigmoid sulcus enters. Once it enters this foramen here, jugular foramen, is called as the internal jugular vein. Now, in the jugular foramen, it's not the only thing that's getting inside is not only the sigmoid sinus. Sigmoid sinus enters and forms internal jugular vein, but also we can see. Can you see this groove right here? You can also see, all right, something else coming also here and draining inside of the jugular foramen. What is it? And this groove right here, or you could call it a fissure, it is between two bones. See, again, I'm mentioning when you look at structure, look at which bones it is on. This is the petrous part of the temporal bone, and this is my basilar part of my occipital bone. So basically, temporal or petrous part and my occipital bone. So this is known as the petro-occipital fissure. Here, what you will find is another sinus that will also enter through the jugular foramen to drain into my jugular vein, which has formed because of the sigmoid sinus. صح? This sinus is going to be what? How do I identify it? What is this bone? Petrous bone. What is the direction of this petrous bone? This is superior, this is inferior. So, inferior petrous sinus. The inferior petrous sinus is going to drain into the jugular foramen. So you have the sigmoid sinus. Once it enters the jugular foramen, it forms internal jugular vein. Also, not only the internal jugular vein is going to be in the jugular foramen, we also have the inferior petrous sinus is also going to be entering through the jugular foramen to drain into the internal jugular vein. Okay? وضحت الفكرة؟ Between those two sinuses, اللي هو the inferior petrous sinus and the sigmoid sinus, between them I have nerves. Nerves number 1, nerve numbers شنو قصدي العفو 9, 10 and 11. 9 glostopharyngeal, 10 is vagus, and 11 is my accessory. So نعيد 1 2 3 4 6. وين ده أشر؟ ده أشر على ال superior orbital fissure. 1 2 3 4 6. 5 was here, the trigeminal. صح؟ إيش بقى؟ 7 and 8 and 9 10 11 and 12. استعوفكم من 7 and 8. I'll discuss 9 10 and 11. We mentioned 9 10 and 11 is here between the two sinuses. 9 10 and 11 is going to be found. 9 10 11 12, just go down, you will see this canal. This is known as the hypoglossal canal. And 8, jugular foramen. We have internal occipital protuberance, transverse sinus, formed this S-shape, sigmoid sinus. Sigmoid sinus أول ما it entered inside of this jugular foramen became internal jugular vein. Also from here is also draining inside of the jugular foramen is what? What is this bone? Petrous bone. Inferior petrous sinus also is draining inside. There's something draining here, something draining here. Between them are nerves number 9, 10 and 11. 12, just go down, you will see this hypoglossal canal, where the cranial nerve number 12 اللي هو hypoglossal nerve is going to be found. Okay? هاي أهم شيء. طبعا this is what the condylar part of my occipital bone. I mentioned one cranial nerve number 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 in the superior orbital fissure. 5 is on the trigeminal impression, causing the trigeminal impression on the petrous bone. 6 to 7 we didn't discuss it. 7 or 8. 6 was in the superior orbital fissure. 7 or 8 we didn't discuss it. 9, 10, 11 was in the jugular foramen. Then the hypoglossal is just below it. We mentioned here is the hypoglossal. تمام. 12. So 6 to 7, where is it? تشوفون ده يمشي بالترتيب. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. 5 was here. 7 and 8 is gonna be, if this is 5, 7 and 8 is also going to be in this region. لأنه 9, 10, 11 هنا, and then 12. ده يمشي شي تتريجيا. Where is 7 and 7 and 8? 7 is the facial nerve and 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulocochlear, from the name cochlea, it's going to the cochlea اللي هو ear. Let's see. So it needs to enter the ear. It needs to enter the internal ear. Where's the internal ear? We look at the petrous part of the temporal bone. This is very important. The petrous part of the temporal bone, we mentioned already that we have the trigeminal impression, which is caused because of my trigeminal nerve. The petrous bone itself, this is, I'll make it like this so you can see it more properly. This is the trigeminal impression where the trigeminal nerve will be. You will also see that there is this huge eminence. Can you see very huge eminence here? Can you see this huge eminence? Eminence يعني شيء طالع. This is known as the arcuate eminence. The arcuate eminence, this one right here, which is part of the petrous bone by the way, but it's an eminence. Can you see it? It's شيء طالع. This is causing the roof of the internal ear. It forms the roof of the internal ear. If it forms the roof of the internal ear, Arcuate eminence forms the roof of the internal ear. Just go down. Do you see this? This is the internal auditory meatus. Internal auditory إذان auditory meatus. Okay? On the pitcher's bone, I have this huge eminence, arcuate eminence. What is the relation or molecular important part? It is the roof of the internal ear. If it's the roof of the internal ear, where's the internal ear? Just go down. هياتي يمهي بالضبط. Internal auditory meatus. Facial nerve and the vestibulocochlear nerve or cranial nerve number 7 and 8, they enter through the internal auditory meatus. وضحت الفكرة؟ Okay? So this is the most important part. If it's forming the roof معناته there needs to be kind of a connection, not an actual connection, بس هو كأنه يعني حفرة أو canal between the internal auditory meatus and external auditory meatus. This is the external auditory meatus, if you remember. This. Now we come to the Norma Basalis. We are starting with the alveolar margins. The alveolar margins is where the teeth are going to be embedded in the bone. طبعا always what did I mention? When we go to a region, we need to identify what is the bone that is going to be attached to. This bone is what? This is the maxilla. This is the maxilla, right? The maxilla. So the alveolar margins are there. What is this? This is known as the incisive fossa. The incisive fossa, because these are what these two teeth هي الانسيسورز. فهذا هو الانسيسيve fossa. Clearly I can see طبعا this is the hard palate كلها. The hard palate is divided by sutures called as the cruciform suture because they form the shape of the crucifixion يعني. Okay, so this is the cruciform suture. Again, a suture meaning one that there's bones that are going to different bones that are attaching to each other. These two bones, they're the same bone, but there's right and left. اللي هو المmaxilla. I mentioned I have a right and a left maxilla. Here's the palatine bone. So the reason for the suture is that there is the maxillary bone, the maxilla bone, and my palatine bone. They are going to be attached together. اللي هو or the point of meeting between them. That's why we have the suture. The suture, this cruciform suture, is dividing my hard palate into 2/3 and 1/3. 2/3 of my hard palate is made by the palatine process of the maxilla bone. What does it mean? Meaning that the bone is the maxilla. اللي هو شفناه هنا استقل شوية. From the maxilla bone, I have a process that goes all the way behind, called as the palatine process because it's going to be attaching to the bone known as the palatine. Do you understand? Palatine process of the maxilla, meaning the bone is the maxilla. From the maxilla I am having a bone, from the maxilla I'm having a process that's coming all the way to attach to the other bone اللي هي البالاتين. لذلك يسموها palatine process. معناته هذا البون شنو؟ هذا is the palatine bone. And this part اللي هو 1/3 of the hard palate is basically called as the horizontal plate of my palatine bone. On the palatine bone, as you can see, it has a palatine crust. All of this is the palatine crust. This is the palatine bone. From it we have a crust. Can you see? Yeah, this is the palatine crust. Again, the same thing here. Palatine crust. This palatine crust, what does it do? Is it's going to be separating. Okay, so just to make sure you understand, this is the palatine bone. I have two parts to it, just like the maxilla. Okay, I have a palatine crust. This right here is my palatine crust. And again, this is my palatine crust. This palatine crust is going to be separating two foramina. You can clearly see them here. I'll show you. So again, this is my palatine bone. I have a crust. صح? This is separating my greater palatine foramen and my lesser palatine foramen. Again, greater palatine foramen, lesser palatine foramen, separated by my palatine crust on both sides. And this is the maxilla. We have at the end of the maxilla something known as the maxillary tuberosity. لأنه again tuberosity from which bone? The maxilla. طبعا what is this bone right here? Again, when I'm looking at the structure, I need to look at the bone. This bone is the butterfly shaped bone اللي هي sphenoid. You remember the sphenoid? It had these processes that are coming all the way down. These are known as the pterygoid process. So this is what? These are the pterygoid process. I have a medial and a lateral pterygoid. Medial and lateral pterygoid. Okay. And let's just remove this so that it's not going to be affecting us. Okay. So I have medial and lateral pterygoid. Okay, medial and lateral. This is the posterior nasal aperture. I have my posterior nasal spine. Here you can clearly see the vomer. I mentioned that the nasal septum was formed by two bones. The ethmoid part makes the upper half, and the lower half is made by the vomer bone. This is the vomer bone, clearly. Okay, posterior nasal spine. This whole thing is the most posterior nasal aperture. This is the vomer bone. طبعا between the medial and the lateral pterygoid processes, because this is the medial, this is the, you get it? Okay, between the medial and the lateral there is the fossa. This fossa is known as what? Pterygoid fossa, because these are pterygoid processes. This is the pterygoid fossa. Okay, here you can clearly see this, right? This is the inferior orbital fissure. Inferior orbital fissure. You can also see the inferior orbital fissure. If I place my pen here, for instance, you will see that it is going to be opening to my inferior orbital fissure. Can you see? This is the orbit. This was my superior, and this is my inferior. Okay, so this is the inferior orbital fissure. This is the pterygoid fossa. I have another fossa known as the palatine, pterygopalatine fossa. Pterygopalatine fossa meaning that the fossa is between my palatine, اللي هو هذا البون. You remember this bone I mentioned? This is my, or this bone, let's say. This is my palatine, right? So this whole thing is my palatine. Between the palatine and my pterygoid, palatine, between the palatine and my pterygoid, I'm going to be having a fossa اللي هو يسموها pterygopalatine fossa اللي هي هاي هنا on this side. Okay, or on this side. Pterygopalatine fossa. This is the pterygoid fossa between the two pterygoids, the medial and the lateral. This is the pterygopalatine fossa between the pterygoid and my palatine bone أيضا. Okay, the pterygopalatine fossa, why is it important? Because this is where the rotundum foramen will open. You remember what was in the rotundum foramen? The first M was the maxillary nerve. The maxillary nerve will enter through the rotundum foramen, and then it will leave and enter into the pterygopalatine fossa. And it makes sense because then the maxillary nerve will come and starts to supply my what? Maxilla. This is my pterygopalatine fossa. This is my pterygopalatine fossa. Mo, pterygopalatine, this is the pterygoid, and the palatine is from here. So this is the palatine. This is the pterygoid. This is the fossa. The rotundum foramen will open in the pterygopalatine fossa, and then you will have the maxillary nerve will come out and starts to supply my maxilla. Do you understand? So pterygoid fossa we understood, and the pterygopalatine fossa we understood. This is the pterygoid, and this is the palatine. Okay, يلا. طبعا what can you see the foramens? Let's identify the foramens. But this is what bone, again, when I want to identify, you see the one. This is which bone? The butterfly shaped bone. This is the sphenoid bone, and I mentioned on the greater wing of my sphenoid bone I have three foramens. The first one was rotundum, which we said mentioned it opens in the pterygopalatine fossa. Then what about the oval and spinosum? This is the oval, and this is the spinosum. Oval, spinosum, oval, spinosum. Okay, what about this foramen? Again, how to identify the relations? This foramen, as you can see, it is the foramen that is separating the two bones, which are the sphenoid bone and what is this bone? What is this? Which part? It is part of my temporal bone, right? This is the petrous part of my temporal bone. This is the mastoid. This is the styloid. Mastoid, styloid. This is the petrous bone of the temporal. Petrous part of the temporal bone. معناتها this foramen that is separating the sphenoid and my petrous part of the temporal. It is the what? Foramen lacerum. You remember? I mentioned the same thing here. How to identify the foramen lacerum is going to be separating the sphenoid and the petrous part. Here the same thing you will see. Okay, separating the sphenoid اللي هو هذا اللي نشوف بيها الأوفال والسبينوزم on the greater wing, and the petrous. So this is the foramen lacerum, and I mentioned right away next to the foramen lacerum you will always find the carotid canal, but here you will see it, yeah, they're right next to each other. But when you go below, they start to separate. As they move, they start to separate, but they're still on the same plane line. So the foramen lacerum, this is my carotid canal. At the same line, you can see this is what? Foramen lacerum, and this is the carotid canal. This huge one right here, it is very close by to my foramen magnum, we said is what? My jugular foramen. This is the jugular foramen. Okay? This is my jugular foramen. The one here. Okay? Jugular foramen. مفهومة. تمام? Next to the foramen magnum. This is what? This is the styloid. This is the mastoid. These are parts of my what temporal bone. Styloid, the mastoid. Between them there is a foramen. This is known as the stylomastoid foramen. Okay, stylomastoid foramen is very important because this is where the facial nerve will leave. The facial nerve and the vestibulocochlear nerve, and cranial nerve number 7 and 8, if you remember, they entered through the what? Internal auditory meatus. And the facial nerve will start to leave from the entered internal auditory meatus, but it will start to leave through the stylomastoid foramen. So that خلاص مو هذا الفيشل nerve يعطي البرانشات مالته الخمسة. If you guys remember, the temporal, the zygomatic, the buccal, the maxillary, the cervical, المهنولك. Okay? So the facial nerve comes out and gives all its motor branches, the 5 that we know about it, and other branches as well. Both. تمام? Then, so this is the styloid, the mastoid we talked about. On the mastoid, you will also see that there are emissionary foramens on the mastoid itself, and these are just called as the mastoid emissionary foramens, where the emissionary veins are going to be leaving. And we mentioned what are emissionary veins. This is the foramen magnum, made of the condylar part of the bone. This is the of the occipital bone. This is the basilar part. These are the condyles that we're talking about. These are posterior, because they're below the condyle, posterior condylar canal. Then what is the hypoglossal canal? So if this is the posterior condylar canal, the hypoglossal canal is the same as the anterior condylar canal, which is this right here. Can you see the condyle? This is the anterior condylar canal, or my hypoglossal canal. If you look, can you see? Look here. It was the same as my hypoglossal canal, اللي هو قلنا 9, 10, 11 cranial nerves, 9, 10, 11, which are in the foramen, jugular foramen, and then 12 you just go down. Okay, so this is what my hypoglossal canal or anterior canal. So don't confuse it. This is the posterior condylar. The anterior condylar or the hypoglossal is here. Variations مرات حتشوفوها هنا in the skull. Doesn't matter. Okay. Then we have my normally اللي هو external occipital protuberance, superior knuckle line, the inferior knuckle line, the external occipital crest. Okay. What else do we have? We have our, and there's the highest knuckle line as well, but it's kind of imaginary, you won't be able to see it. We also have the mastoid process, the styloid we already mentioned. We mentioned the stylomastoid foramen, very important. Here I have a groove, some sort of groove here. This is known as occipital groove because this is where it's on the occipital bone, right? And this is where the occipital artery is going to be running. Okay. I don't think we missed anything. This is my external auditory meatus. We also have my, what is this? What are these? This is basically where my, this is known as the mandibular fossa because this is where the mandible is going to be attached. If you know, we know it is the mandible. It is this movable part of the skull, right? So lower jaw basically. How is the lower jaw going to be attached, or the mandible is going to be attached? Through this way. Okay, so it's going to be like this. It's going to be attaching like this, and تخيلوا ED is the lower jaw, and so this is what is happening. This is where the mandible is going to be attaching. It is on the mandibular fossa right here. تمام? This one. خوش? I think this is it that we need to know. Yeah. Okay, there's not much here. Inshallah وضحت الفكرة. I really hope the video was useful for you guys. If you do have any questions, do let me know. Thank you.